Hi everyone, my name's Tia Matawarda, and I'm really excited and happy to be sharing some of what I've been working on with all of you today, and of course hearing your feedback during the discussion that follows. I'd like to thank the organizers of this year's RASE conference. These events are always such a highlight, especially when they were in person, but I'm just pleased that we can still get together and be inspired virtually amongst everything that is happening in the world. So I'm a third-year PhD candidate in Anthrozoology at the University of Exeter and a member of the EASE working group, as many here today are, as well as a junior fellow in the Global Research Network's Animals and Biodiversity think tank program. And in a professional capacity relevant to this talk, but also relevant to the methodologies and methods I've utilized for this research, I'm a former guide dog mobility instructor of 6 years with experience educating 30 guide dogs and running a guide dog school as a certified dog educator and behavior consultant from the German Chamber of Commerce. Today I'll be introducing the central theme of my PhD research, for which Irish Guide Dogs for the Blind acted as a really great case study, and that is humane interspecies emotional labor. Now, this is a concept I have coined that aligns, of course, very strongly with Coulter's concept of humane jobs, and I'll unpack what exactly I mean, or rather what Coulter means by that in just a moment. But with this research, my focus lies at the intersection of animal labor studies and emotion management studies. And specifically, it focuses on the emotional labor that guide dogs and their guide dog mobility instructors, who I'll just refer to as GDMIs, perform with and for each other during their shared work lives. But I won't go into too much detail about them today, and rather use this time and use this chance to introduce the concept of humane interspecies emotional labor in a way that it might hopefully be applicable to most, if not all, of your research as well. So with the entirety of my PhD taking place during this pandemic, the traditional in-person multi-species ethnography I had planned was entirely reconstructed multiple times with virtual alternatives. But I ended up conducting 28 lengthy qualitative and semi-structured interviews over Zoom with video with 26 very diverse interlocutors, and we had follow-up interviews, email exchanges throughout the research process, and I followed them and Irish Guide Dogs for the Blind on socials to gain further insight there as well. I also drew from my own notes and further documentation of the 6 years spent as a GDMI to write a 6-year multi-species autoethnography to really bring in some more reflexive insight and descriptions of the canines I had educated, to then compare and contrast with what interlocutors told me about their own observations and experiences. And this was just a way to bring in canine narratives the best I could in a time of travel restrictions and lockdowns, also making this research not only academic but quite personal as well. And before I touch on emotional labor, I thought I'd mention what I even mean by humane. And I really do find this term quite problematic, yet find the increasing number of terms being created for so much within anthrozoology almost equally problematic and confusing, most importantly, and have therefore decided to align with Coulter's terms to maintain some consistency here. Now, within animal labor studies, Coulter refers to humane jobs as being mutually good and beneficial across a species, moving toward not only improving existing jobs, but also reconstructing or creating entirely new humane jobs if need be and where appropriate. And in this case, guide dogs and their GDMIs are unique in that they are co-workers who simultaneously embody a teacher-student relationship. So within humane education then, humane can roughly be understood as having the constructive, at times reconstructive, ambition to acknowledge and act on our coexistence with other species in a mutually beneficial manner so that we can live ethically and sustainably within and as multi-species communities. And regarding the training of canines, humane is understood often as this utilization of positive reinforcement coupled with non-aversive management strategies. So if we take all of that, within the educational environment and work environment of guide dogs and GDMIs, then humane nods toward the need for GDMIs and their employers, so the guide dog schools, to gain clarity around and actively work on creatively envisioning and offering a sustainable, empowering, ethical and constructive education for guide dogs that's strongly supported by the use of appropriate, predominantly positive education methods to allow for, but also support, humane interspecies emotional labor practice over the long term, ideally. But why look at emotional labor? Well, to put this simply, managing our emotions is central to everything we do. And that animals with emotions manage them is not really up to much debate, at least by those who are appropriately informed and up to date on the current research on the topic. And without managing emotions, no one would be able to survive, essentially. We wouldn't be able to hunt, we wouldn't be able to communicate effectively, we wouldn't have patience, and so on. We would just be a ticking time bomb, let alone function interpersonally within social groups. And emotional labor, as I will get into in just a moment, is merely one form of emotion management and is absolutely essential to carry out any task as part of a formal job involving exchanges, which is essentially the majority of jobs, right? So animals are performing emotional labor, and this talk is not setting out to discuss or prove this point further. I have listed here some literature addressing the emotional labor of other species if you are interested. The problems really come from the incredible, surprising actually, lack of attention paid to labeling emotional labor as such, or even considering and supporting how workers are performing it. And while there are publications stating that other animals perform emotional labor more as a side note or maybe an aspect of a paper or chapter, this is the first research conducted on it specifically, which is quite shocking considering, again, how absolutely central it is to formal work. Now, in contrast, the role of emotional labor in the work lives of humans, predominantly in able-bodied human-human exchanges, has been researched extensively. But there's still this strong ableist and anthropocentric twist to the direction of the field and even the definitions themselves. And if we agree with Coulter, which my research does, that just as all humans work, so do all individuals of other species, in the form of mandated, voluntary subsistence or eco-social work, in the form of either formal or informal jobs, then it becomes clear how great the need is really to be discussing emotional labor much more than both academics and practitioners currently are, because it's relevant to most, if not all, of our research when seen through this lens. And so discussions and initial definitions around emotional labor can be traced back to Hochschild, who researched most notably flight attendants actually. And they defined emotional labor as the induction or suppression of feeling to sustain an outward appearance as part of formal work-related interactions with exchange value. And so again, placing an emphasis here on appearance and sight really highlights the anthropocentric and ableist nature of these definitions, because they're ignoring the communication of emotional states through scent, for example, across species, or acoustically to visually impaired individuals. And how Hochschild defines something as having exchange value is also steeped in Marx's definitions of value, which viewed other species as working, predominantly restricted to physical laborers on farms, but ultimately presented them as tools, as resources, as having physical value themselves. So a fundamental shift is really needed here as well in a move toward humane interspecies emotional labor to really reassess what exchange value is for other species in these interactions and adjust the definition of emotional labor accordingly. Now, emotional labor is performed to align with social, cultural, and organizational guidelines, for example, that are referred to as feeling rules. And to use guide dogs as an example here, how are the dogs perceived in the society they work in? Are they seen as dirty, or do people see it as work that's benefiting society? What are the expectations of how they behave while working that are placed on them by the guide dog school and GDMI? So these might not have the dog's emotional well-being in mind. They might be too rigid so that a guide dog is not given some understanding or leeway when they are having a bad day, or otherwise not be realistic for long-term emotional labor performances. And on the other hand, they might be very flexible and encourage the dog's individual expression and prioritize their enjoyment of their work, as was luckily the case with interlocutors participating in this research. Then we have just the two basic strategies used to perform emotional labor, which will generally point us in the direction of whether an individual is performing humane or detrimental emotional labor. And again, this is just a very brief summary, right? Essentially, they can either be utilizing surface acting strategy, which means they are suppressing or faking an emotion display in such a way that their feelings and emotions are not in alignment with what they are presenting and expected to present. And as you might figure from this definition, surface acting, with research done again predominantly with humans, is linked very strongly to burnout, it's linked to emotional exhaustion, and is very detrimental to identity. Just to list a few examples, the list essentially goes on. And this is especially the case if performed over long periods of time or consistently over a shorter period of time. Then we have the deep acting strategy, where workers are redirecting or inducing emotions so that how they feel is in alignment with the emotion displays and demeanors they present. And this can be an active effort in that the worker might empathize with the recipient of their emotional labor in order to conjure up a friendly demeanor, or it can be passive. So for example, passive deep acting would be if you are a happy Labrador having a great day, you just finished a long walk and were given a biscuit that you quite enjoyed, you might not be putting in active effort to, in that moment on that day, wag your tail and be friendly to a human individual you are offering a service for. But a guide dog performing active deep acting might see a sandwich on the floor while they are working. Their GDMI might ask them to ignore it through performing impulse control, which is one outcome of emotional labor. They likely really want the sandwich, but through the active deep acting, alter how they perceive the situation by remembering that they have learned that their human partner, the GDMI, will have a much better reward for them if they don't give in to their impulses in this moment. And as a result, they don't suppress their feelings as they would with surface acting to ignore the sandwich, but rather actively change how they feel about ignoring the sandwich in a more positive manner. So deep acting, and specifically passive deep acting, is really what humane interspecies emotional labor is aiming for and working toward increasing. Now, the concept of humane interspecies emotional labor recognizes individuals of other species as not only physically carrying out tasks, but performing varying levels of emotional labor, which can, depending on a variety of factors, be either detrimental or humane. And as a concept, it can be understood as the holistic consideration of the emotional labor performed by animals with and for other species as part of formal jobs by acknowledging their entire work lives and feeling roles. And humane interspecies emotional labor then also means taking that information to move toward providing and supporting opportunities for workers to perform deep, predominantly passive deep acting, including the reconstruction of job structures and expectations, or creating entirely new jobs where individuals who are interested in and suitable for the work can have their feelings and emotions align more naturally with the emotion displays expected of them. So hopefully more attention directed to this can create meaningful impact between human workers and their co-workers of other species. Thank you very much for listening. Here is my contact information. I look forward to any questions anyone might have or any discussions after the conference via email or otherwise as well, if we don't get the chance to talk here. Thank you.